Osmosis is basically the passive movement or the diffusion of water across a membrane. So it's the passive movement diffusion across a membrane. Right? Now, it is not influenced by the membrane potential, so it's independent of the membrane potential. Just because water is not being treated like a charged particle or any other type of substance. Okay, water freely moves across that membrane. So it is not influenced by the membrane potential. Okay. Now, the way that water does move is along its own concentration gradient. So if we have an area of high water concentration, water will move freely to distribute itself across that membrane according to its gradient. Okay, so water moves along its concentration gradient. Okay, and this is independent of any other solute movement. All right, so let's look at a scenario here with two cells. And we'll talk about the solute concentration here. And the concentration of water. Okay. And we'll describe this inside versus outside. And the same thing on this side. Okay. So let's say, first of all, we want to understand that this membrane is impermeable to the solute in question. So I'll just make a note here. The membrane is impermeable to the solute in question. Okay, so let's talk about our solute concentrations. Let's say that inside the cell, we have 1 mole of a certain solute, right? So 1 mole, whereas outside the cell, we have 0 moles of that. Okay, and then let's talk about the water concentration. Let's say inside the cell, we have 100 moles of water, and outside the cell, we have slightly more, so 102 moles of water outside the cell. And let's look at another scenario over here. Let's say inside this cell, we have a similar solute concentration as cell 1. So we also have 1 mole inside this second cell. And then outside that cell, we actually have more of this concentration, more of this solute. Okay, so we have much more of this solute outside the cell membrane of this second cell. Okay. And in terms of the water concentration of the second cell, we also have 100 moles inside the cell. And then outside the cell, we have slightly less. So let's say we have 99 moles in terms of the water concentration. All right, so in this scenario, let's look at the way that water will move. Let's look at the concentration gradient of our solutes first. Okay, so in this first scenario, we have a concentration gradient established with the solute, where we have a higher concentration inside the cell and a lower concentration, 0, outside the cell. And so there's a tendency here where this solute would want to move outside the cell. But there is a problem. This membrane is impermeable to the solute. So the solute cannot move here. So what will happen is water will move according to its gradient to compensate for the concentration gradient of that solute. So I'll explain what that means. If the solute wants to equalize itself or get to equilibrium, it's going to draw water to it in order to dilute itself. Okay, so we're going to have the concentration of water moving from outside the cell, right, outside the cell, inside the cell, and this is going to be to compensate for that concentration gradient where the solute wants to move out, but it cannot because the membrane is impermeable to that solute. Alrighty, and so water moves into the cell to compensate for that in the first scenario.
Only when the membrane's permeable to
Right.
the solute, that's when it draws the water in.
Correct, correct. So the solute cannot move according to the concentration gradient, so water moves instead. Alrighty. Let's see what happens in the second scenario. So in the second scenario, what is the direction of our concentration gradient in terms of the solute? Where would the solute want to go? It wants to go into the cell, but can it go into the cell? It cannot because the membrane is impermeable to the solute. So what will happen instead? Water will move out of the cell, right? The concentration or the particles on the outside of the cell will draw water to them to dilute themselves. And so water will move outside of the cell in compensation for that concentration gradient. Okay, and this is how osmosis occurs. It's the movement of water where solutes cannot move. Okay, so the free movement of water according to its concentration gradient. So essentially in this first scenario, because we had a solute concentration, we also had a water concentration. Does that make sense? Because the solute was more concentrated inside the cell, automatically water is less concentrated inside the cell. And so we have a water gradient here as well, where water wants to move inside the cell. In the second scenario, same thing. Because we have a concentration gradient where that particle wants to move into the cell, but it cannot, water will then move according to its concentration gradient. So an area where it's higher in concentration, right? So there's more water inside the cell than there is outside, and so water moves freely along its own concentration gradient. Okay? Correct. So the one on the left would be hypotonic, and the one on the right would be hypertonic, indicating the solute concentration there. Alrighty. Now it's important to remember here, let's make 2 points here. The first one is that the driving force here, so the driving force is the concentration gradient of water. Okay, that's what's really driving the movement of water here. Okay. The second thing we want to point out is if the membrane is impermeable to the solute, then water moves according to its gradient to compensate. Okay, so if the membrane is impermeable to the solute in question, then water will move according to its concentration gradient to compensate for that.